Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final session for the 2016 Science Diplomacy Symposium. My name is Cynthia Robinson, and I direct the Science and Technology Policy Fellowships, known as STPF, here at AAAS. You are in Washington, D.C., land of acronyms. So again, welcome. It's wonderful for us to have such a broadly international audience and a diverse panel for this session to delve into the opportunities to connect science and policy around the world. You know, there are many governments, universities, national academies, learned societies, and other stakeholders who are working very hard to address the science policy divide through a variety of mechanisms and approaches really across the globe. And here at AAAS, we've been operating our S&T Policy Fellowships for more than 40 years. And increasingly, I mean, that program started because of the challenges of needing science to inform policy, but I think increasingly, over the decades, there are more and more decisions that need critical information from science and technical perspectives to make sure that the right policies and programs and actions are put into place, not only at the national scale, but obviously international scales. As I mentioned, there are a variety of mechanisms. There are routes for involving scientists and engineers in decision-making, but the routes are not always clear to individuals, and they're not always available to individuals from a broad range of scientific and engineering backgrounds or from a broad range of career stages. These are some of the things that we've been experiencing in our program over the years. And there's growing international interest and demand for programs and mechanisms like that, in large part, I think, because of a need, but also because we're not meeting demand, a need for policy and for the people, connecting at that interface. You know, of course, there are the traditional science advisory roles, such as chief science advisors, advisory committees, honorific members on national academies. There are the more experiential engagement opportunities like the Science and Technology Policy Fellowships and many other fine fellowships, internships and pairing schemes. There are capacity building initiatives such as courses, specialized trainings, and workshops. In my role, though, I've received many inquiries from countries and organizations around the world who are seeking information about how they might launch programs similar to our Science and Technology Policy Fellowships. And in fact, there are now programs modeled on STPF in Asia, Canada, Israel, and Switzerland, as well as new federal programs here in Washington, D.C., modeled in part on us, and state-level programs in the United States. And I wanted to note that, in fact, it's been interesting that I think every panel and session here today has at least had a STPF fellow on it, or the program has been mentioned. So it's wonderful to hear that there's such a perceived value to the work that AAAS launched more than 4 decades ago. But in response to this growing international interest and demand for designing, implementing, and evaluating science policy connection mechanisms, we were pleased to have generous support from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for AAAS to conduct a landscape analysis and to start planning for a feasibility assessment that broadly explores the challenges and the opportunities for greater international S&T connections and strategies to address them. So we were funded, and over the more than the past 12 months have been working on the landscape analysis and some of the planning, as I mentioned, for the feasibility assessment. That project, and there's an outline here that you can look up on the screen, that has been advised by some very high-level internal and external advisors, some of whom I'm very pleased are here with us today and have given us critical input to help this be a comprehensive and successful endeavor. So we've conducted this project with worldwide consultation with more than 150 individuals and organizations from 50 countries have provided input to map and analyze existing approaches to engage scientists and engineers with policy processes. And a report on the project, which will be published later this summer, consolidates for the first time a whole catalog of cases and examples of the different modalities for connecting scientists and engineers around the world. And we're very excited to have this report serve as a resource and a practical guide for the many different stakeholders who are interested in developing mechanisms to bridge the divide between scientific and policy communities, and those who are interested in, just in general, in having greater science and technical expertise in the policymaking process. So as you, I first also want to put a shout out to thank the many individuals and organizations who are around the world who took the time to complete the surveys. Some of them didn't realize that if they answered a few questions in a certain way, they were going to get additional surveys sent to them, and they filled those out as well. And that was providing critical and valuable input to the project that we've worked on. And you'll note number 4 on the slide says develop a global community of practice. I'm very excited to share with you that the Moore Foundation has provided funding to evolve this program into creating what we hope to be a global science and technology policy portal that will be a resource, but also hopefully serve as a hub to connect networks of boundary-spanning leaders who are working at the intersection of science and policy. And our aim will be to unveil that in about a year, perhaps at the 2017 Science Diplomacy Symposium. So this afternoon's session allows us to share with you some of the initial findings and to highlight some individuals who are involved in several types of science policy connection mechanisms. One mechanism that has thrived for years in the UK, a pairing scheme, another newly emerging initiative and activities in Mexico, and a regional initiative entering its 3rd year of operation in Asia. But before we hear about those particular cases, I'm going to ask my colleague Marga Gual to provide a summary of the project of its outputs to date. And just to give you a little bit of background on Marga, I know that there were bios up on the website. But Marga joined the staff of AAAS back in March 2015 to focus on science diplomacy outreach and training, but in particular to be the project lead on this landscape analysis and feasibility study. And she previously was a science diplomacy scholar at AAAS. We saw good things. We wanted her on full time. We're happy to have her. She was working with international and security affairs and science diplomacy. She also holds an adjunct professorship with the Arizona State University Center for Science and Policy Outcomes. And Marga received her PhD in biomedical sciences at the University of Queensland in Australia, and her bachelor's and master's degrees in molecular biology at the University of Barcelona in Spain. So without further ado, I welcome my colleague Marga to give you an overview of this project. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. I have to say, working on this project has been an amazing journey, literally, and obviously because we've been around the world for a year, working, talking, and interviewing many of the groups and stakeholders and governments, and we're so happy, as Cynthia said, that many of you are here today with us and travel from very far. I will give you just a very quick overview because I really want you to listen to our special guest today that came to share their models and mechanisms with you. But because when you ask, how do we do this? How can we find all those mechanisms and that are very discoordinated and not easily accounted for? So we did 3 mixed methods approach. We did surveys to collect quantitative and qualitative data. In general, to learn about the status of the science policy connections in countries around the world, and then more specifically to learn about the countries that did have fellowships or internships or these types of science policy engagement models to get their specific details, so then we could put them in the database that you'll see in the report when we release it this summer. And then we did some targeted consultations with experts, stakeholders all around the world, and especially we wanted to hear from the mechanisms and the administrators, the former fellows, the current fellows, the funders, and get all the perspectives of what works, what doesn't, what were the challenges, the barriers, and the successes and lessons learned, so we can put that together and then share it with you more broadly. We work with the science attachés here in Washington, D.C. to see which countries were, so to see where the countries stand in this space and see their interest. And we've had some countries that have been very engaged with us since the beginning, very interested. And then we had a wonderful advisory committee, and two of our members, Chris and Ernesto, are here today, so I really want to thank them as well. And of course, we did the traditional research in lead reviews, and there's a lot of information that we found that we're trying to systematize and categorize, and again, put in a database and catalog that can be a resource for anyone around the world looking to strengthen or develop their mechanisms for science policy connection. And we asked 4 simple questions to our, we launched this broad global survey, and we were very curious to see what would come back. And we wanted to know what are the institutions and the key stakeholders in the different countries to the success of these mechanisms. Could be government, could be universities, could be academies of sciences, could be think tanks. And it was incredibly important to see how different those are in importance and weight in each country. And we wanted to know what factors and criteria enable or hinder these connections, and what are the models that are most effective in that particular country and context, and why. And then we collected the resources and the reports and everything that they had available for us to put in this landscape analysis. And Cynthia has already mentioned we had an overwhelming response. We had more than 130 stakeholders giving us input, and from more than 50 countries, both at the national level and at the regional level. And we identified more than 100 different mechanisms, and I'll get into that in a minute. But I wanted to, just that graph on the pie chart shows what stakeholders were the most responsive, and we found around a third of the responses came from academia, a third came from government, and then the remaining third was a combination of academies of science, industry, science societies, think tanks, NGOs, foundations, multilaterals, and others. So we're preparing a number of charts and tables, and we want catalogs for you to really have quick access and see what are the main models. And Cynthia already introduced some of them, and we found that there were 6 broadly the major models for science policy connection, and that's broadly speaking. Most of them are hybrids, and we really need to get into each country detail to see what the exact specifications of each are. But mostly we found science policy fellowships, which usually they tend to be for PhD level or after scientists, and they are long, so they usually last for a year minimum to allow for a full immersion in the office, or the host office in a government or a policy. And we wanted to see the purpose. We wanted to ask about the purposes and the motivations, and why the host institutions wanted to host those fellows, and why the scientists wanted to. What was the motivation for them to apply to such opportunities? And it ranges from learning about how their research can better impact policy, and then go back to academia and write better, broader impacts for NSF or NIH, for example. But others want really to change careers and move into science policy, so that's a perfect opportunity to experience, to really get into the community and get the skills and the networks that allow for a transition, if that's the objective. And then we're going to hear about this long fellowship model. We, of course, know the US model, which is the AAAS fellowship, but also the ASEAN model that Addie is going to talk about. It's a fellowship type program. Then science policy internships, they tend to be for younger grad students, undergrads that haven't decided yet what they want to do with their scientific training, and this allows them for a short-term, short commitment, and go to a parliament office or a government office to see what it's like, and to experience the policy world before making a leap. And that's very valuable, because sometimes when one finishes the PhD and wants to transition, there are no skills or networks developed yet, and they have to invest more resources. money and time getting the extra training. So getting those experiences early in the scientific training, and I think that's something Chris can talk about, really allows them to make the transition faster if they want after their training. And then we found quite a few pairing schemes, and that's basically, it's mostly in the legislative branch and in parliaments, and they can be shadowing schemes in which scientists and MPs switch places or shadow each other for a week and really experience each other's worlds and really improves mutual understanding and relationships. And other countries, for example, Australia has many secondments and rotations, so civil servants go to academia and vice versa for a few months, and really improves, especially as their work requires more technical and scientific expertise. They need this to be embedded in a scientific environment to really grasp better how those scientific issues affect their policy making. And then other programs are more traditional capacity building and training, so how we provide exposure or initial training experiences for scientists in policy. And then what we represent here today, conferences, dialogue meetings, breakfast seminars that bring together both communities. And that's, of course, the most frequent mechanism, but also, and it allows for networking, but because they are very short, usually the connections are not so deep. So there is a range of the time that you need to be in contact or embedded into a policy setting to really get the skills and the network. So if you want to transition. And very quickly, so I talked about how we travel all around the world, and we really enjoyed going to many meetings and international fora to conduct focus groups and interviews. And we went to Jakarta, so the orientation week of the ASEAN Fellowship. We're gonna hear about them in a minute. The Trieste program that I just mentioned in the previous session, in which we bring together scientists and policymakers from developing countries for a week. We participated in the first science diplomacy meeting in Latin America. It was hosted by UNESCO in Montevideo, and this is in honor of our other external advisory member, Ernesto Fernandez Polcuch from UNESCO. And of course, the World Science Forum, and this is a meeting that I recommend everybody to, if there's the opportunity to attend, because it's really one of the few opportunities for high-level science policymakers and young scientists to come together, and it's a very wonderful occasion to experience the interface. And as I said, the report we're going to publish in the summer, and it's going to include all of this in much more detail, and you're going to find all the reports and all the data that we have collected, and we will index it and categorize it so it's easier for you to start or to strengthen any existing mechanism or program that might exist in your country. And I'm talking broadly because I know we are live on webcast, so hopefully we have audience from many countries right now. And as Cynthia was mentioning, our goal for this second year, the second stage of the program, is to create, so not only a report that's going to be a PDF report sitting in our website, we really want to do something that can evolve and it can be interactive and connect the communities of fellows, administrators, funders together and be an interactive, evolving platform. And as more programs are created, and we hope that countries will be inspired to start their own mechanisms, they can be added to this platform, and it will be searchable, and we'll have all sorts of criteria that you can select for, and we will include announcements and opportunities, conferences, courses, fellowships, and hopefully that will bring everybody together in one place, because we feel that is exactly what is missing right now. Information is not yet centralized. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our three invited speakers today, and they represent very different models and in different countries, and they will showcase a little bit how is it like to establish and to sustain science policy connection mechanism in their countries, and what were the challenges and successes in this various programs that they either started or took on. Our first speaker is Addie Ryan. She is the Finance and Operations Manager for the ASEAN-U.S. Partnership for Good Governance, Equitable and Sustainable Development and Security, which we call PROGRESS. She's based in Jakarta, and she manages, supports the PROGRESS initiatives, and with a special focus on the ASEAN-U.S. Science and Technology Fellowships, which embeds scientists from ASEAN countries in ministries with the objective of strengthening science-based policy at the national and regional levels. I'm going to introduce the three speakers at once because their presentations flow, and I don't want to interrupt them because they are closely linked to each other. Our second speaker will be Chris Tyler. Chris is the director of the UK Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, or POST, and previously he was the executive director of the Centre for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge. Prior to that, he worked at the House of Commons, where he was science advisor to the Science and Technology Select Committee and Sense About Science, which is a charity promoting science in public debates. And Chris has been part, or is part of many of those types of mechanisms, and can really give a really good picture of the UK, what are the different mechanisms in the UK. And also he's a member of our advisory board for this project. And finally, Pepe Franco from Mexico. He is the director of the newly created Office for Information on Science and Technology for the General Congress of the United Mexican States. And this is one of the emerging programs that we were able to capture in the beginning. So it was really a fantastic discovery that when we talked to Chris, then we found that the UK and Mexico were working together to develop this capacity, science capacity in the Parliament of Mexico. And Pepe is a professor at the Instituto de Astronomía de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, known as UNAM. And he's the former president of the Mexican Academy of Science, general director of the Science Outreach Center of UNAM, and the chair of the Foro Consultivo Tecnológico de México, a science and technology think tank in Mexico. And also fun fact, he organized 2 Guinness records for Mexico, one for the largest number of persons observing the moon with a telescope, and the other one for the largest number of children commanding a small robot with a cellular phone. So he has multiple hats. And I would like to first welcome Addie Ryan to the podium.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Marga and Cynthia for the welcome and introduction. As they said, I am one of the managers of the ASEAN-U.S. Science and Technology Fellowship, which is one of the initiatives of the USAID-funded ASEAN-U.S. Partnership for Good Governance, Equitable and Sustainable Development and Security. That is a regional Jakarta-based project that engages all 10 member states. So ASEAN is the association of Southeast Asian nations, comprising of these 10 countries. And so I'd like to share a bit about the evolution of the fellowship and where we are so far. So it's really part of one of the main objectives under our Promoting Regional Leadership component is to support ASEAN in institutionalizing science-based policymaking. And the main vehicle that we're using to do that is this fellowship, which was launched in 2014. And so we just finished our second cycle and are preparing to begin the third. So the goals of the fellowship are to advance regional cooperation, to strengthen evidence and science-based policymaking, to build scientists' capacity to influence policy, and to enhance U.S.-ASEAN science and technology cooperation. It embeds PhD scientists in government institutions for 1 year within their own countries. There's a competitive selection process with input from USAID, the U.S. Mission to ASEAN, the ASEAN Secretariat, as well as the national level committee on science and technology representatives. The fellowship includes mentoring and capacity building elements to it, specifically for communication and leadership. What does it mean to transition from the lab or academia into policy, and how do you shift the way you communicate? And it's modeled on a successful U.S. program that many of you may have heard of, the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program. So it was actually kind of the brainchild of two AAAS policy fellow alumni who are working within USAID. And so they really kind of shaped the direction of our fellowship and guided us on the whole evolution of that. And so Dr. Teresa Leonardo was one of the key drivers in that, and she unfortunately couldn't be here today. So the S&T fellow activities include scientific information synthesis and analysis, developing policy recommendations and policy briefs, organizing workshops to inform policy, interfacing between government and scientific community, as well as communicating to the public. So some of our fellows have activities in universities and schools to inform about what are the pressing issues affecting their country and their region at that time, as well as the U.S. Mission to ASEAN has a blog that our fellows can contribute to on a rotating basis that also helps them share their work with the community. Just a snapshot of kind of where we started and where we are. In the first year, 2014 to 2015, we had 6 fellows from 5 countries, focusing on 5 thematic areas. In the second year, we increased that to 14 fellows from 7 countries and narrowed our thematic areas a bit to better align with U.S. and ASEAN priorities, and also fewer thematic areas helped for greater collaboration among the fellows across countries. Mid-year, in the second cycle, we worked with some consultants to do an analysis on the fellowship. What are the strengths, what are the barriers, and how can we sustain it, more importantly, because the USAID-funded Progress Project is a 5-year US-funded activity, but what happens when that funding runs out? How can we keep this network growing and keep the fellowship sustainable? And so as part of that analysis, one of the greatest challenges that was identified is placement of fellows in appropriate line ministries. This is because with our USAID-funded project, our main counterpart within ASEAN Secretariat is the Committee on Science and Technology. So that lends itself to the easiest placement is within the Ministries of Science and Technology. And so some of our fellows who have been placed in the Ministry of Science and Technology said, I really could have had greater impact if I was in, say, the Ministry of Energy. And so thinking about how can we strengthen ties to get our fellows more connected to the line ministries. And so one of the recommendations from that analysis was to shift again our thematic areas for the third cycle so they better align with some of the priorities of the Committee on Science and Technology subcommittee. So that's what when you see this acronym COST up here, it's the Committee on Science and Technology within ASEAN. And so thinking about how we can better expand the engagement with that committee. And so as we look ahead to our third year, the goal is to have 16 fellows from 8 countries represented. So that would be all of the ASEAN member states that the USAID funding can directly support. Those are the developing countries. Omitting Singapore and Brunei. But the 3 thematic areas for this coming year are climate, sustainable energy, and STI policy more broadly. So some of the other challenges that we have already faced or we anticipate facing are linked to just adapting to the expansion and the growth of this fellowship. So initially it was a pilot program. We only had 6 fellows completing that year, and then just this past year to having twice as many. And then in this recent recruitment process and selection process, we even doubled the number of applicants, so from, say, 60 to 130. And just from a management and administrative standpoint, how do we manage a continually growing influx of applications, which is a great problem to have. But furthermore, how do we monitor and evaluate these fellows And then how do we cultivate an engaging alumni network, which is something I'm sure we can learn from the AAAS fellows on. And then further, the mentor identification and role has been something that we're still trying to find the right structure for. So we've engaged some AAAS fellow alumni, particularly in the first year, to try to connect U.S. scientists with our ASEAN scientists. That's been very positive, but we're a bit uncertain how to go about forging those relationships because the timing of AAAS fellows doesn't always align with the timing of our fellowship, and across how do we communicate and link across time zones and various language and other barriers. So that's something that we're still working on, as well as how can we get mentors within their region, maybe policymakers within their countries. So one thing that this year we're looking at trying to engage those cost subcommittee members to be mentors within there, to advise on how does policy work within their country, as well as it'd be great to have less formal American mentors to say this is how I did that transition from the lab or academia to policymaking. And then of course funding is always a question. And so as part of this sustainability analysis, the institution that was identified as the best suited host to continue the implementation of the fellowship after U.S. funding under progress runs out is the Asean Foundation. And so right now in our we're heading into the third cycle, even though the USAID progress is still fully owning the management and funding of the fellowship, we've already started including an Asean Foundation to shadow this process, to get up to speed, to understand how we do things so they can think about in this transition, how can they fit it into their structure, their financial and management structure, but also to think about how can we diversify funding and what benefits could that bring in terms of potentially funding fellows from Singapore and Brunei, potentially funding fellows for longer than 1 year, because that's always something I'm sure any fellows in the room could say, the first year is fine, but really you hit your stride right at the end of that year, and if you could continue for a second year, what impact could you have? And so those are basically kind of the three factors for success that were identified, is that new implementing institution, refining management and placement, and ensuring financial viability. So just briefly share some highlights. I know we're be wrapping up here, but so I can't go into too much detail, but Lada was one of our pilot year fellows from Thailand. She helped establish the first biotech resources center within Thailand, linking resources from academia, private sector, as well as research institutions to pool together resources, creating a culture collection of over 15,000 species, as well as recommended policy, put forth recommendations for protocol for how to share and manage that genetic material and resources. So there are plenty other success stories that I won't go into detail on, but one, I will just mention the last bullet point on this slide. One of our second year fellows from Malaysia, Dr. Nofri Dahlan, has been working on a plan of action for solar thermal policy in Malaysia, and she is with me today and will be presenting a poster after this session. So I encourage you to talk to her, learn about her work and her experience with the ASEAN-U.S. S&T Fellowship.
Chris? I'll just breathe out.
Thank you. Hello, it's great to be here. I don't know about you guys, but I found this to be an absolutely fascinating day. I didn't know what to expect because, as many people have noticed, science diplomacy can mean many different things to many different people, and today I've learned a huge amount. Normally, when I give, say, like a 40-minute talk, I generally try and develop 1 point well. I've got 10 minutes, I'm going to try and cover 3. So keep up, and maybe if we're interested in any of the specifics, we can deal with that in Q&A. So I'm going to cover 3 things: legislative science advice, the fellowship programs that Marga has told me I have to talk about, and the third thing is legislative science diplomacy. So first up, legislative science advice. Legislation and legislatures is the main focus of my professional life because I work in the UK Parliament. And all around the world, there's been a huge amount of emphasis put on trying to improve the role of evidence and the role of science in making public policy. But the bulk of that exercise has taken place in executives, central government agencies and in agencies appended to government. And that's great. That should be happening. However, the vast majority of countries have very important legislatures where the laws actually get made, but very few of those parliaments have any kind of meaningful science advisory infrastructures within them. If you're going to do science advice properly, you need to take care of both government and parliament to make that happen. So, the second thing, fellowship programs. There are, broadly speaking, 3 kinds of fellowship programs that I'm going to quickly whiz through, one of which wasn't really on the list there. There's embedding scientists in policy, which we've heard quite a bit about already. There's going the other way, taking policymakers and putting them into academia, which hasn't been covered. And then there's pairing schemes. So, the first type, embedding scientists in policy. AAAS runs the Leading Light program, the gold standard program on this, and has done for a number of years. For what it's worth, we have something quite similar in the UK Parliament, where we bring fellows, PhD fellows in for 3 months at a time to work on policy briefs. So it's a much shorter time frame and it's a quick turnaround, and it's something that lots of other parliaments are starting to use as well. You get an injection of enthusiastic PhD students who are awesome because you can work them like 80 hours a week and they come back for more. And they're also free because we get their PhD funders to fund that. So you can double your FTE in your work programme for next to no cash to your parliament, while injecting a huge amount of expertise and training up the next generation of researchers to understand how parliaments work, what makes legislators tick and politicians enthused. The pairing schemes, there's quite a lot of these. I think probably the most internationally known is the pairing scheme run by the Royal Society in the UK, where they hook up academics with politicians primarily. And the academics will spend some time in Parliament and the politicians will go and spend some time in the lab. Now, these take a huge amount of work to undertake, and the successful pairings are really, really valuable. The problem is that not all of the pairings work terribly well. So what I did when I was working at the Centre for Science and Policy in Cambridge was set up a policy fellowship programme which took policymakers out of their policy world and threw them into the university. Because connections between people are kind of like basic research. You have to do a lot of it to get those big wins out the other side. So what we did was we'd bring in policymakers and ask them to list a dozen questions that, if answered, would make their lives easier in their day jobs. And then we'd match them up on the basis of those questions to somewhere between 20 and 30 academics in the course of a 5 days set of meetings. And it was absolutely extraordinary. One participant told me it was the equivalent of, the intellectual equivalent of sucking on a fire hydrant. It was absolutely exhausting. But out of those sort of 20 to 30 meetings, you'd usually find that there'd be sort of 2 or 3 meetings that are a total waste of time. No one knew what they were doing there. The bulk of the meetings would be sort of interesting, and then you'd have maybe 2, 3, 4 meetings that would completely change the way that the policymakers were thinking about the work that they were doing. And that's what you're after. And there's no way to predict which one of those meetings would have it. So you need to throw lots of these connections at people. So after that first week, we'd then have a 2-year program of engagement between the policymaker and the University of Cambridge. And that took many different forms, from taking academics back down into the policy domain for workshops or helping them work through policy problems, from bringing more of the policymakers up to Cambridge for workshops, involving them in the co-production of research models so that we were actually designing research programs in the university with policy impact in mind. It's absolutely been an extraordinary program, and I think the most amazing thing to me that kind of like says how cool this is when we started this, it was free because we had to get the policymakers in the door, and they were like, what's this going to do for us? They're now charging a very, very strapped civil service £2,500, that's $3,600 per fellowship. So we're actually charging the policymakers to be a part of that, and we cannot keep up with the demand. Right, that's fellowships done. Third item, legislative science diplomacy. We've heard a lot today about connections between government agencies, but there's a lot going on between parliaments as well, and I'm just going to list a few of them. My office, the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, was actually modelled on the Office of Technology Assessment that was here in the US up until '95, when it got axed to the chagrin of a large community in the research of researchers here. The OTA's legacy, though, is alive and well in Europe, and there's 13 full members of a parliamentary technology assessment network based all around Europe, and we get together twice a year, every year. The presidency shifts from one country to the other, and it's a fantastic forum for sharing best practice. The directors get together to share the work that we're doing, the staff get together, the communication officers get together. It really is a fabulous community for developing the important work that we have, trying to inject science advice and technology assessment into the legislative programme. There are associate members not in Europe, and the US does actually have a member based out of the GAO, where a fraction of the OTA's function was placed. So the chief scientist there, Tim Persons, is a frequent attender. There's also been quite a lot of work from UK Parliament trying to help other parliaments use science and evidence and research methods more effectively in the work that they do. So one example of this is Myanmar, which has been going through quite a long process over the last few years of setting up a brand new parliament. It's not something we have to grapple with in most countries, but they're actually having to set this all up from scratch. And we've had full-time staff based there since, I think, 2013, trying to help them do that. One of them has been specifically a science advisor who is helping them to design their research services within the Parliament so that they do a good job of using research methods, good policy analysis skills, and injecting evidence into the legislature. We're also part of a programme that is POST, the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, funded by DFID, which is our international development agency in the UK. And we're currently working with Malawi and Kenya to help train up their parliamentary staff to make better use of analysis. And we've had 4 staffers come over from those 2 countries to spend a month each with us in Parliament for training purposes. And it's been really interesting seeing the challenges that they face. I hadn't really predicted what would be the difficulties. Obviously, resource is a massive problem, but the people they send are extraordinary. They can turn around work so fast. Their ability to take on information quickly and then turn something out that is readable for policymakers is impressive. The thing that we found they needed most work on was knowing how to be impartial and what impartiality actually looked like. And I don't think that we do a good enough job of training researchers generally on that when we're talking about engaging with policy. And the final example I want to give is connections between international legislatures. The commitment to using evidence in policy, as I said, has been growing and growing, and it is beginning to catch up in parliaments around the world. The EPTA network is a fantastic beacon for that, but there are other parliaments around the world trying to take on that level of expertise and embed offices that are responsible for proactively pushing evidence into their legislative processes. One example of that is Mexico. A chance meeting that I had with the head of their Science and Innovation Committee on stage. I gave a talk about what we did in Post, and he came up to me afterwards and said, "We don't have anything like that here, and I think we should." And so the next day I was ferried into Mexico City, and in typical Mexico style, you've suddenly got a million meetings lined up before you that didn't exist 12 hours ago. And we knocked a few heads together, and in rapid time, we've ended up with Mexico setting up a science advisory centre for its parliament, on which note I should hand over to Pepe to tell you how it's going.
Oops. Un susto, pero no, lo conseguimos. Sí, 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 sí.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I think I'm the only obstacle between you and the reception, so I'm going to try to be brief. And as Chris said, we started this new office, which is called In Situ. We couldn't find a sexiest name, so if some of you have a better name for it, we'll be welcoming this suggestion. Because in the UK, the office is called POST, Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, so short and catchy. In situ is not a great name, but you know, it's an acronym for Oficina de Información Científica y Tecnológica para el Congreso de la Unión, which its translation is over there. Okay, this is a new office for information on science and technology for the Mexican Congress, which is a two-chamber assembly. One is the Senate, which is the upper chamber, and the other one is the Deputies Chamber, which is the lower chamber. And we started this initiative, as Chris said, very recently, and we started already with 3 research advisors. You're going to see, I'm going to show you in a second, the highly complicated system that we had in Mexico, which was not working for several decades. We had this science advisory for both the government and the parliament in Mexico, and for several reasons it simply didn't work. So we're switching gears and we're using the methodology of POST, which I think is a very, very sensitive methodology, because it combines the expertise of advisors who are researchers and a group of students who do, as he mentioned, basically the work. So here are the objectives of the office, and I'm not going to go through this. It's very simple. It's just to provide information to the parliament so they can do better decisions in their work. And we're going to be focusing in producing different things, and perhaps the key instrument that we're going to be producing is a 4 to 6 page note, which it follows the post notes that they have been doing for over 25 years, who are really, really good. You know, in a very, very brief space, they provide key information based on scientific evidence, and the notes are simply great. I will encourage you to go into the post internet place and check some of the notes. They are really, really good. And so we're going to be doing also briefings for some of the committees that whenever they need it, and we're going to be doing events to bring together both parliaments with academics, with the academic community. Let me show you how complicated this game is, or it has been in Mexico. The main council to take decisions on science and technology is the General Council of Scientific Research, Technological Development, and Innovation, which is chaired by the President of Mexico, and it has 10 state ministries, and it has also 8 institutions of science and technology. So one may think that this is a really broad council which might provide very good advice to the government and to the parliament. However, this council by law should be meeting twice a year, every year. But in the last 2 administrations, the federal administration in Mexico lasts 6 years. So for the last 15 years, they met only twice, once for each one of the administrations. And the new administration has been doing much better. So we have been getting together once a year, and the discussions had improved. And I think that this had created a higher sensitivity for the president of the importance of science and technology in the future of Mexico. And here are the 4, oops, wait a minute. Okay, there are 4 bodies that are supposed to provide information to the president of Mexico. One is here, CONACYT, which is the equivalent of NSF in Mexico. The other one is the Science Advisory Board that was created by a presidential decree in '89. And the other one is this new President's Office for Science and Technology that was created recently. So these three institutions are supposed to provide advice to the President of Mexico. And also the Science and Technology Advisory Forum, which is the one that I'm chairing, is supposed to provide advice to the President of Mexico, is supposed to provide advice to CONACYT, and also is the only one that it's supposed to provide advice to the Congress of the Union. So this, not duplicity, not triplicity, but quadruplicity of advice has had zero impact in because the president simply doesn't use the information from any of this body. Actually, as I said, this General Council didn't meet as the law required twice a year, but only once for each one of the terms of the previous administrations. So what we have been doing nowadays is just to shift gears and try to rethink the whole thing. So the head of these 4 boards are right here. He is the president advisor. He's a mathematician. He is the advisor from the, what was the name? Let me just go back. The Science Advisory Board. Oops. So he's an atomic physicist. He's the head of CONACYT, the NSF in Mexico. He is a person who has a degree in economics and policy making, and this is me. And okay, now we're doing a new engineering of the whole thing, and I'm going to let the other 3 bodies to provide the advice to the president, and we're going to be focusing only in CONACYT and in the Congress of the Union. In the case of CONACYT, see this Science and Technology Advisory Forum is a think tank. It has 17 institutions. Institutions that go from all the academies, the Academy of Science, Engineering, Medicine, History, and so on. More than 200 universities that are gathered together in one union, and also industrial chambers. So you have this really broad spectrum of different expertise that works really well whenever you talk to the funding agency, because all of them are interested in have some funding channel into each one of their groups, but do not work that well whenever you talk to the Congress of the Union, because they don't want to do the dirty work of preparing all the information for the Congress. So we decided that within this institution, we will create in situ. We created this new office, and this new office will hire something like 10 or 12 scientists that will be working with the students to provide all the information that the Congress requires. So we had already 3, as I said, and we're going to be hiring at the end of this year some other 2, and then next year we're going to be hiring some more. So the whole thing started, as Chris said, when he visited Mexico a couple of years ago. He gave his 40-minute speech talking about the importance of science and technology for Parliament, and he was quite convincing that as he mentioned, so a lot of meetings were created immediately after that. And then in June of last year, we visited London and we signed a memorandum of understanding with Post to have some advice in how to create this new office. And we started last February the office, and we're working on several of the products that I mentioned before already. And obviously there are very many obstacles in Mexico. One of the key ones is the resistance from lawmakers, because they think science is very complex and it only matters to some experts. So they don't think, or they didn't think, that it's useful to have this advice. And also they think, or they used to think, that science has no impact in the everyday life of Mexicans. And one of the main worries that they had, they don't mention, is that any knowledge that one put into the lawmaking might be against political interests of important groups, so they don't want to play with that. And anyway, so there are several obstacles here, but there are several good enablers. I think that within the last 3 years, we have improved a lot the relationship between academia, the Congress, and the government, and now policymakers are much more conscious that science and technology is really helpful in making better decisions. So I think I'm going to stop here, and we can pass to the session of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to call all speakers to the podium, and I'll do the very risky thing of taking 5 minutes from the reception and letting you ask questions, because I saw everybody tweeting, taking photos, and I think the interest is is evident. So let's take a few very quick questions. Please, can you go up to the microphones?
Hi, Jessica Taff. I think what's going on to connect policy to the rest of the world is fantastic, and getting scientists engaged in policy with policymakers and doing policy themselves. And it's fantastic that there's actually programs set up for this, and it's great seeing that going on with the Asian collaboration as well. I'm wondering, are there ways to measure the impact? Is that something that's built into these programs, and could you comment on that a little bit?
Measuring impact for these kinds of programs is a pain. It's really, really hard to do. When I first started at Post, I was asked, how effective is Post? And my honest answer was, I haven't got a clue. The current measures for how good we were at doing stuff was how many post notes we produced in a particular year was one of the measures. I remember getting a phone call from the guy who handled the sort of the audit of performance in Parliament, saying that the previous year we'd produced, I can't remember what, 31 post notes, and that this year we'd produced 30, and could I explain what had gone wrong? Another measure is, how many bums on seats you get at events and so on, but I would much rather have one MP at an event who walks away and completely turns an argument in Parliament versus 20 who come up and aren't interested. So, to tackle this problem, we've actually got a evaluation program underway at the moment in Parliament that's been going for 2 years, and we're in the analysis stage before reporting later this year, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, looking at how evidence is used across Parliament. And of course, a chunk of that is looking at how Post does its job. So it's slightly scary to see what those results will be. But we need that level of in-depth, case-based analysis, comparative analysis, to get a real feel for how evidence is used in such complicated political settings.
Yes, that's definitely a challenge and something that we think about on our project. And our main quantitative metric for our fellowship is number of policy recommendations formally put forth to a government, a ministry or a government official. But of course, with 1 year terms, it's unrealistic to say how many have been implemented, in 12 months. And so that would, I think, require some longer term follow-up to try to see what are the actual policy-related impacts. We we submit surveys to our government counterparts as well as to our fellows, asking for their feedback and say, was this person impactful? Did they advance science-based policymaking in your ministry? And if they say yes, we can try to verify that or count that, but it can be a bit subjective as well. But there are certainly anecdotal and more other qualitative impacts that we've seen, especially from the side of professional developments. If you talk to the fellows themselves and hear what they say in terms of, this is how I've grown into a science diplomat, you could say, or just professionally, the networks that are established. I mean, we can count the alumni and growing networks and connections, especially something that we've seen a big increase in from year 1 to year 2 is kind of counting those collaborations across countries among fellows is something that's a little bit easier to measure, but it's certainly a challenge that we'll continue to face.
And I will add that we are, in the research project, we are looking at impact on policy and impact on fellows' careers, because sometimes the impact on fellows' careers is easier to report and track. And also, these are two separate things that we're looking at. And of course, getting that line into legislation, that can happen 10 years later. And we had a case in one of the congressional fellows 10 years ago. So a bill was passed recently. So 10 years later we have that line. So looking at impact on policy, but also impact on fellows' careers and expanding their career options beyond academia. Ernesto?
Thank you. I wanted to congratulate the project. Is really, really wonderful because it opens so many options for further work. In particular, when you look at it from the point of view of developing countries, where this is still very much to come. So it's also great to see this bridge between post and in situ. And going about post, I wanted to ask you a question about the mechanism that was not on the picture. So the policymakers that you bring to the university. What do you mean by policymakers in that phrase? At what level? Yeah, who are those?
Yeah, sure. So that's run by the Centre for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge, which was my previous job. And there are 3 levels that come. The bulk of them are mid-level, so what we would call deputy director and director. So quite senior, command big budgets, but aren't sort of mired by the everyday challenge of doing policy. They're sort of directing teams to deliver policy. Those make up the bulk of the policy makers. And a similar level in corporations as well. There are industry partners too. There's a junior policy fellowship program for typically people on there who have been identified as future leaders but aren't there yet. And and there's a fewer number of those. But there's also a senior fellowships program. That's not what it's called. I can't remember what it's called. Senior Leaders Fellowship Program or something. And that's for Director Generals. That's for people who head up whole government departments. And that has actually quite an international flavour as well, bringing in policy leaders from around the world in small cohorts to try and deal with some common issues.
We have no further questions. I'm going to hand it over to Tom Wang, who will close officially the conference. Thank you again, our speakers, and thank you for coming.